Next year we're going to turn off the Wi-Fi during the questions and see how people do. Okay, so I chair the ecosystem subgroup of the ARB, which is basically dealing with issues that are not adding new features to the specifications. And just an update on what we've been doing over the last year. So first, documentation updates on the progress towards a new conformance test suite, some issues with the spec that are not new features, but are other things we want to do with it, and some other projects that are not really our projects, but that are ecosystem-like and that we thought would be of interest to people. So the man pages have been updated for the API 4.2 and GLSL 4.20 again. They're posted on the website today. The link is not very visible there, thanks to some interaction between MS Office and OpenOffice, I think, but it's in the usual location, opengl.org/SDK. And once again, Graham Sellers did this work for us. Graham, if you're here, please stand up and take a bow. So, conformance test suite. This is where we've been spending most of our effort over the last period of time. We got the Khronos promoters to approve funding for doing a new conformance test suite back in December, and we have an external contractor that's been working away at it ever since. We started off with the OpenGL ES 2.0 conformance suite, which, roughly speaking, already tests what you would call the core profile functionality of OpenGL 2.0, even though OpenGL 2.0 didn't have a core profile that roughly corresponds to the ES 2.0 feature set. We've made pretty substantial progress toward coverage of OpenGL 3.3 and some selected later features. The contractor has about somewhat over 50% of the work done, and we expect the first version of the new CTS will be released in November. And future OpenGL ES versions will also be using this code base, since they will be using more desktop functionality. Go to the mobile BOF tomorrow morning, isn't it? And you may hear something about that, or not, I don't know what they're going to say. And what this should lead to is, since we haven't updated the conformance test in something like 12 years or so, so more consistency in error reporting, fewer implementation divergences, fewer cases of behavior that is not what the spec says. We're also working on a new process for adopters, which is the technical term within Khronos for people who actually sign a legal agreement and say, yes, we will pass the conformance test in order to use your trademark and logos and so on, which most of the other Khronos APIs already do for their conformance test suites and their APIs and trademarks. So undefined behavior. I did an exercise a few months back where I looked at the GL spec and all the places where it said something like X is undefined or doing this is implementation-specific behavior, and came up with about 80 examples. We would like to reduce those as much as possible. This is in large part motivated by WebGL, which really wants to produce a uniform experience across the whole range of devices and drivers and platforms that it runs on. And so when they started implementing their API on top of OpenGL ES and on top of various versions of GL, they found they had to do a great deal of wrapper work, in part to be more consistent and eliminate implementation of different behaviors that they cared about, in part for security areas too. Now, there are some areas that we're probably not going to be able to tighten up on. In particular, vendors tend to be very sensitive to things that would steal performance. So things like validating indices in an index draw call, probably not going to do that. Things like what happens when you call some GL function and you don't have a context bound is very dependent on how people implemented their ICD or their GL library or whatever mechanism they use. And again, we probably can't mandate that, since a lot of it is driven by things that platform vendors say it's going to work that way and we can't control. We probably don't really care a lot about implementation-specific behaviors in the compatibility profile, since we're encouraging people to get away from using that, so we are not going to concentrate on that. Things we definitely are going to work on are error behavior. The GL spec, we've pretty frequently had an extension that says doing this wrong type parameter gives you an invalid operation state, and we promote it to the core and say, no, that really ought to be invalid value. No one ever fixes their drivers, so that's definitely something conformance test can address as well. A lot of the implementation-specific behavior arose because old hardware was fixed function, it was low precision, and it did different techniques for approximating things, and these days people tend to do things in much higher precision and much more uniformly. And then there are a lot of other miscellaneous issues that we are working through one by one and making gradual progress. Something else that's putting some pressure on getting more consistency is the OpenGL and OpenGL ES convergence. We now have ES being provided as an option on some desktop platforms. We have people moving code back and forth between ES and GL implementations. And so we have a group in Khronos that's looking at the places where those specs differ and don't necessarily need to and trying to fix that. So we're never going to be pixel precise, but the undefined behaviors will definitely be reduced over time. Okay. Next, spec restructuring, which is kind of my personal pet project since I'm the API spec editor. GL is up to its 14th API release version now, over about 20 years actually since GL 1.0. Most of that functionality has been added by people who wrote some extension, either as a vendor extension or an ARB extension, and then later it got promoted to the core. So a lot of different authors writing in slightly different styles. Sometimes they didn't always understand the guidelines as well as they should have. Sometimes they just preferred to write things in different ways and we never corrected it. And so the spec looks a lot different just due to the different authors to begin with. The spec is still structured around the old OpenGL 1.0 fixed function hardware pipeline. You have vertex processing, you have fragment processing, and then we bolted on all of the shader stuff, all of the new functionality just got written in around that. So that means that understanding some new feature often requires that you leap around the spec a lot. You say, okay, maybe I have some new frame buffer feature that's in chapter 4, but the queries about that are in chapter 6. The generic errors when I pass some invalid enum happen to be defined globally back in chapter 2. There's some errors around maybe uses of buffer objects that apply globally but are only described where you talk about buffer objects. So what we want to do is make the spec easier to write, easier to read, easier for people to write extensions for, and easier to maintain. And all of that should also help with some of these inconsistent and undefined behaviors going forward. So starting shortly after SIGGRAPH, we have the ARB signed off on this and have an outline for what we want to do now. We're going to reorganize the spec without adding new functionality around shaders, objects, and the core profile API. We'll start off describing data flows, such as, for example, the diagram that Barthold had up at the beginning of this talk, and it's on the back of the t-shirts we'll be handing out. Okay, so where does data come from? Where does it go to in the system? How do the objects interact? What's the execution model? How do you interact with the different window systems that you may be embedded in? How do multiple contexts share data and interact? Second, I want to reduce inconsistencies by refactoring out common language. A lot of times we'd add some new shader stage and we duplicate some piece of wording, so maybe it got slightly varied in the process. And that's led to some pain. So we're going to find all of those, try and pull them into one place, and have only one instance of each. And I'll describe the general concepts and behaviors first, and then specific objects. We'll, for example, describe what is a shader, how do you get parameters in and out of it, and then we say, okay, here's a vertex shader, a tessellation shader, a geometry shader, etc., and the special things about them. And finally, try to reduce the amount of non-local knowledge and spec leaping about. So, for example, pulling all of the errors for each call into an enumerated list with each call, which will make the spec a bit bigger, but a lot of people have complained about this. And again, the intent is no functional changes. It'll still be a 4.2 API spec. It'll just be restructured dramatically and hopefully much easier to read. Okay. Now, a couple of projects that are not ecosystem TSG projects officially, but that people might want to hear about. Christoph Riccio, I'm not actually sure how to pronounce his last name, unfortunately, since we only talk by email, has got an OpenGL 4.2 sample pack. It's hosted inside the GL SDK area, but it is his own project. That link may be a little hard to read, but the spec presentation is being posted to the website, I take it. And he says that it provides coverage of all the new 4.2 features, not necessarily deep, but broad. Second, there's a book that's being edited by Patrick Kazi, who I believe is here today. He is here. Stand up, Patrick, so people can see you. And Christoph, and they've asked that we put their call for authors out here. So it's a compilation of contributed articles from the OpenGL community. Focuses on experience of programmers with GL, ES, and WebGL. and covers a lot of areas. The ones that were mentioned were rendering methods, performance tuning, platform-specific information, debugging techniques, and focusing on specific GL features. It's to be released at, that's my timer, released at SIGGRAPH next year, and there's a call for authors open until the 25th of this month. So they have a blog, which is linked in here, which you can go to, or you can email the authors, editors@openglinsights.com, or you can pin down Patrick after we're finished here and talk with him. Okay, that's all for the ecosystem. Thanks.